Alright, welcome to wireless LAN configuration. So this is being recorded in the bright early sunny morning. It's a bit bright in the office, but it's good. Alright, so what are we doing today? We're going to go over the configuration of wireless networks, and we'll be looking at adding a wireless controller and using WPA2 with pre-shared key authentication for it. So this will be a basic wireless network with a wireless controller, followed by a enterprise version where we use the servers for authentication. We'll then round it off with troubleshooting wireless issues. So remote workers will tend to be working from a home or a mobile device, and these domestic routers are integrated routers, so they're all in one device. So they provide our wireless DHCP, NAT, quality of service, and port forwarding and various other features depending on the vendor and the operating system in use. And they tend to plug into either a DSL or a cable and provide all you need for at home. So most of these routers are pre-configured and connect to the default network defined in the device's configuration. So these will give you a default IP address, username and password. And because they're defaults from the manufacturer, these can be easily found with a simple Google search or whatever search engine you're using. So, or what you need to do to change these defaults is to log in via your web browser onto the default IP address for your device, and that IP address can be found in the documentation that came with the device. Commonly, the default username and password is admin, so we need to change these things. So the steps: log into your router with your web browser, change the default admin password, log in with the new password so it confirms that the password has taken effect, change the default IP addresses used in the DHCP server, then renew any of the IP addresses required. So if anybody had logged in using the DHCP server, they get their addresses renewed, and then re-log in to the system again. Because you've changed the IP addresses, you will lose your connection, so you need to re-log in. After that, you can go in and set up your wireless defaults and basically make sure you've got the 802.11 and the version, so whether it's G, N, AC, whatever it is that you need set. Configure your server set identifier, change your channel setting. Now, depending on what you're using, you may or may not be able to manually change this. Configure your security mode, whether you're using WPA2, personal, enterprise, whatever you're using, and then put in your passphrase and security mode. Now remember, we always recommend a passphrase. This gives you a more robust password. So as a generic configuration, if you've got multiple access points throughout your home. You might need them to become fully covered because the wireless gets absorbed and reflected with all the walls and cabling and everything throughout the house. So by adding additional access points, you get the coverage that you need, and all what you need to do is ensure that you change the channel, and this will allow you to alternate the frequency that each access point is using so that they don't interfere with each other, creating a fully meshed network that is not self-interfering. So typically your device will have NAT turned on by default, as you only have one public address that's provided to you by your service provider, and you need this on so that you can have multiple machines inside your network to get your device's internet access. Now, most service providers are still transitioning to IPv6, so you need to contact your service provider to find out whether they're running IPv6 or not. Quality of service needs to be configured. So what you need to come in is select your type of service that you want to classify, give it a priority value, and describe what type of applications is happening. So here you've got highest priority to any IP phones, Netflix for streaming, and obviously this person plays Counter-Strike a lot because they've given that high priority as well. Port forwarding allows you to open up to the outside world specific ports, and you can specify if a traffic from the outside arrives on a certain port, it'll trigger a forwarding, and you can either keep it on the same port number or redirect it to a specific port and IP address normally. So, basic configuration. Alright, so what we will need to do is to set up a basic network with a lightweight access point with a wireless controller. Now this is different to our autonomous access points. These lightweight access points need the controller to be able to function. Now they will default back to a local service with no external access if the controller disappears. So you need to make sure that you have trunking enabled between the router and the wireless controller and the controller and the access point. We'll go through the steps. So depending on the version of controller, the interface will change a little bit, but as a general rule, it'll have the same or similar functionality. So when you log in, you'll get your default page, and in the 3500's case, this will be a summary page of what's going on. So what you want to do is come down to your access points in the left-hand menu, and this will give you a list of any access points that are associated, and it gathers all this information via Cisco Discovery Protocol, and it acknowledges any associations it has. Now, some default settings will come out of the box typically, and what we can do is go through the various options to look at advanced features and summary pages, and this is where we basically access everything that we need to get information on. As you can see, it's all nicely color coded so we can see exactly where cables are plugged in on the device. So generally speaking, a wireless controller has layer 2 switch ports. This is required to provide that trunking feature I was talking about. So we need to be able to carry multiple VLANs around. So we need the ability to have a layer 2 switch and VLANing and trunking. So what we're going to go through is creating a wireless network, applying and enabling the wireless LAN, selecting the interface that we're using, securing the wireless, and verifying that it's operational, monitoring its operation, and viewing client information as we go through. So under the wireless LANs tab, we need to create a new wireless LAN, and we do this by giving it a profile name and an SSID. We then need to apply that by ensuring that the status is enabled. And remember to click the apply button up in the top right hand corner to push those changes you make into the config file. Then choose your interface group, and again we need to make sure which method of security we're using. So AES, WPA2, enable pre-shared keys, put our key in place, and at all times remember to click that apply button in the top right hand corner, or else none of these changes we're making will be saved. Alright, so now we come to verify that what we've done is running. So we go to the left hand menu under wireless LANs, and we should be able to see our new profile and the SSID. Okay, so under monitoring in the top menu, we'll be able to go in there into the summary page and see our wireless setup being active in the bottom right hand corner. That confirms everything is running. Now if we scroll down on the monitoring menu on the left hand side, right down the bottom there should be a clients tab. Click on that and it'll bring up any clients that have associated itself with our wireless access point. Moving on to the enterprise version. So the enterprise version, we're using a Radius server to have a database of all authorized users. So it's a big database of usernames and passwords, and we will need to have access to that server. And we also need simple network management protocol running so that we can have log messages kept, and we'll have a look at how we're doing this. So under management on the wireless controller, we need to click on SNMP on the left hand side and then trap receivers, and then go across, hit the new button on the top right hand side. We then point this to the server that we're logging these messages to. Now remember to apply your changes. Next, we need to tell the controller that we're using a radius server. So under the security top-down menu, we look at the AAA menu on the right, sorry, the left. I'll get my rights and lefts correct eventually. You'll see radius, and then under radius, you'll see authentication. This allows you to create a new radius server entry where you'll need to put in the IP address and the shared secret password. Now, we are using the radius server to authenticate the clients, but we need to authenticate the wireless controller and the server. We use a pre-shared key for this. Don't forget to hit the apply button. Okay, if it's applied correctly, under the page of security, you'll see the authentication server being listed, and its status should be enabled. Alright, now we start looking at our VLANs. So the wireless controller needs its own virtual interface, and it's got 5 virtual ports. So what we need is a VLAN from the router coming across to the wireless controller. So we need to go in and set up our trunking and our sub interfaces. I'm not going to go in on doing router on a stick. We covered that in a previous chapter. So if you need a refresh, go have a look on the previous chapter for that. Set up your sub interfaces, your IP addresses, and enable trunking, and confirm your addressing with the show IP interface brief command. Now let's get back to the wireless controller. Again, we need to go through, configure the interface, the VLAN ID, the ports, DHCP server addresses, and make sure everything's working. So we want to set up a new controller, and under the controller menu we want to go to interface and select new, and then say give it a name and a VLAN ID. So in this case we're applying VLAN 5 and we're calling it VLAN 5. Apply, and then we go to the interface and edit, and we set it up on the interfaces on our local switch on the controller, and then give it the address pool information. So we need to configure its IP address, the network mask, and default gateway, so that when traffic comes in via an access point, it can go out. Now, for the DHCP server, we need to specify the location of the server, and enable it if we've got special features. So if we've got IP phones and things like that, make sure you tick the appropriate boxes and get it all set up. But to start off with, we're just going to do a very simple, okay, we're on, this is where you get your DHCP server, and point it to it, and then apply your changes and confirm. So now if we go under the interface menu, under controller, we should now see VLAN 5. Now if you look up, we have a user wireless LAN which is on VLAN 10 with its own set of addresses. We now need to configure our scope for our DHCP server. So let's go through the steps here. So this is on the wireless controller, and on the left-hand menu you'll find the internal DHCP server, and click on the scope, select new, and then give the name to the scope. Then we need to set up the actual scope itself. So we need to configure it, give it its start and ending address, its network, network mask, default gateway, so the default routers, any DNS servers, and change the status to enabled. And make sure you hit that apply button. So if we look under our scopes, we should see our new wireless management sitting up the top there in the scope list. Now we need to set up our various elements that we need for the enterprise wireless. So we're going to use 802.1x for key management. So we need to be able to talk to the server. So we need to go through and configure the wireless controller to use the Radius server to authenticate. So under the wireless LANs tab, we need to create a new one, hit the go button. That'll change the page to the new one, and now we enter our profile and our SSID, and now we can change the ID and apply. The ID, we want to choose the VLAN if we can. Alright, so under General tab, we have to make sure it's enabled. We need to make sure it's using the correct interface, the VLAN 5. We then apply that and confirm, and then go across to the Security tab, select the WPA2 Enterprise, and we want to turn on the 802.1x. Then we move across to the AAA server, put in the server address and port number that it's running on. Make sure we apply those, and then go to the wireless and check that our client wireless is enabled. So what's the typical problems? Now, you should always use the 6 steps of troubleshooting. You should know those 6 steps by now. So basically, you need to develop a systematic approach to troubleshooting. And just as a reminder, here are the 6 steps. Identify the problem, establish a theory of probable causes, test a theory to determine cause, then come up with a plan of action to resolve the problem and put it in place. Verify that it resolves the problem and full functionality has returned. If that's occurred, document your findings and actions and outcomes. So if there's no connectivity, we should check that the network configuration with the ipconfig command on the client. We should try to ping a known IP address. You might need to reload the drivers if they're out of date, or they may have come corrupt. If the NIC is working, then go through and check to make sure the security mode encryption settings are compatible with the access points. If you are connected but it's performing poorly, one of the things that is most common is you may be too far away from the access point. You might have a new channel popping up from a neighbor which may be causing you interference, so you may need to check your channel settings. So this one, doesn't surprise me that often, but it does. Make sure the devices are still there. Somebody might have liberated them. And make sure the power is still on. You won't be able to get connectivity if your access point hasn't got power. Now, you might go, oh, wireless is the answer to everything, but guess what? That access points need to be connected back into the wired world. So check to make sure your physical cables are in place and connected properly. Okay, so just go through and inspect everything. I mean, you may have had a nice rodent munching on the cable. Okay, to increase your efficiency, you may need to upgrade your wireless clients. I mean, remember, the older the standard, the less performance you're going to get. So you should have all your devices running on the same standard, and the higher the standard, the better your traffic is going to be. You may need to upgrade your devices to take advantage of new technologies as they come out, and that's a decision for return on investment. Split your frequencies, if possible, between the 2.4 gigahertz and the 5 gigahertz band ranges, because the 2.4 gigahertz is going to be crowded because there's lots of services that take advantage of the 2.4 gigahertz range. Generally speaking, your bandwidth available is going to be higher in the 5 gigahertz range than the 2.4. Make sure your line of sight between your wireless device and your access points are free of obstructions such as furniture, walls, and tall appliances, as all of these things cause disruption to the radio waves, which shortens your effective range. You may need to find ways of putting in extenders, such as Powerline Wireless. So this is where you pull Argent into an PowerPoint, and it connects to the wireless network. So there's various technologies that allow us to do that. Lastly, you may need to update the firmware on your access points or your controllers. Now, when you're doing this, make sure your power is stable, because if you brick something halfway through, so if you lose power while having deleted the old firmware and pushing out the new one, that device doesn't have an operating system, and it's just a expensive paperweight from that point. Now, the benefit of the controller is you can download the new file for your access points firmware and then use the controller to push out that new file to all the access points at once. So, in summary, please ensure you do the packet tracer activities or the labs associated with this chapter, as setting up the wireless controllers can be a little tricky for the first time or two until you get into the swing of getting all those little settings correct, especially if you're doing the radius server. So if you're doing enterprise, it just becomes that little bit more complex. All right, so remote workers usually use a composite device that has all these services inbuilt, providing DHCP, switch services, network address translation, quality of service, all in one, and they give you approximately about 40-45 meters indoors and 90 meters outdoors. So we'll be looking, and we did look at setting it up using lightweight access points with a lightweight access point protocol, which is what's used to communicate between the controller and the access points. To do this, we had to configure the controller and set it up to use specific interfaces and VLANs to enable that communication. We then had a look at using the enterprise level, which put an extra couple of degrees of complication into the configuration, because we need to set it up so that the SNMP messages could be logged. So we looked at doing the traps and sending to a server. We also looked at how to set up the authentication process and using various interfaces and VLANs to allow the control of our authentication process. So we need a trunk out to our router so that we got access to our radius servers. And then we set up the controller to work with the WPA2 Enterprise Edition, pointing it to the various servers. And lastly, we looked at being able to use the controller to push out firmware upgrades to our access points, as well as any updates within the firmware that provide security features or new updates generally. There's always a good reason for checking that the firmware is current. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. Now, as I said, please ensure you do the packet tracer activities. Setting up the radius server in packet tracer is fairly straightforward, whereas setting it up on live equipment takes a little bit more work. But that's for another day. All right, enjoy your day, and I'll catch you next time around.